Project management students, we are on to chapter 5, which is all about project scope management. In common speak, how big is your project going to be? So what are our objectives? We're going to be talking about why good scope management is important and how you go about it. We're also going to talk about how we determine requirements for a project so we can determine how big it's going to be in the first place. We're also going to talk about the all-important structure of work breakdowns, specifically work breakdown structures, or WBSs. And also, how we validate the size of the project. How do we determine if we've made the project the right size for what we hope to accomplish? And how do we keep from going over the size that we have determined we need? We're also going to talk about how we can use IT approaches to better manage our projects, including software, and a few words about agile development as well, again, going into non-predictive kind of iterative processes. Guys, there are a couple of horror stories I share in the presentation to be able to allow you to see how bad scope creep can be. Scope creep is a popular term for a project that gets out of control in size. Between the United States Air Force and even going up to our good friends to the north in Canada, projects can go completely out of control financially if scope is not contained. And again, if you don't know how big your scope is to be, there's no way you can manage it. And if you're not careful, you can quickly lose sight of how big your project was supposed to be in the first place. So how about this for an example of scope creep? We've decided we need a new car. Our old car is falling apart. Our budget is $250 a month. And we walk into the dealership, and unfortunately, we don't have a strong project management backbone for this project because new cars are addictive, and all of a sudden, the really fancy stereo, the big wheels, and the leather interior look fantastic, and our $250 a month budget is now $425 a month. In other words, we go from the economy car to the hot rod, and how are we going to pay for it? That's the question. So what is project scope management? Project scope management is really trying to control and manage the size of a project. The bigger the project, generally speaking, the larger the expense, the more complex it gets. So project scope management means we're defining how big the project should be, what is and is not in scope, or what is out of scope. And we have many processes which help us in this regard. So what are the main processes under this area? If we're into scope management, we have to plan. We have to plan and determine how we're going to determine scope and how we're going to manage requirements. We're also going to collect requirements. In other words, if we're doing a project, we're going to conduct information to determine how big the project should be. Our end users, our potential end users, and stakeholders are good at providing that information. Once we have planned our scope management processes, once we've collected requirements, then we define how big the scope is going to be. We know how large the project is going to be. And then, just like a good DJ, we break it down. We create the work breakdown structure, the WBS. This is an art, folks, as much as it is a science. Once we've created the work breakdown structure, we also validate the scope. So we're determining that we've made the right size project. And during execution of the project, we're controlling the scope to make sure if people want additional parts added to the project, that we are not allowing our project to go out of scope. So again, if we look at this entire area, if we're talking about scope management, for example, as one of our key knowledge areas, what happens underneath that? What are the project management process groups? We've got planning, we've got collecting requirements, defining, creating the work breakdown structure, validating scope, and controlling scope. And again, all of these have inputs and tools and techniques and outputs according to the PMI standard. I think our text does a really good job of defining these, so I'm not going to read this to you verbatim, but the bottom line is we're talking about a whole cyclical process here between planning how we're going to manage the size of the project, collecting requirements to actually determine the size of the project, then define based on those requirements how big it'll be, create work breakdown structures that will represent the scope that we have defined. We're going to validate it. We want to make sure that, yes, we've done the right thing here. We've chosen the right size of the project. And finally, we're going to control it. If you've ever been a subcontractor on a project and the customer wants more than they originally set out for, that almost always costs money. So in terms of planning, we basically start off by saying we've got experts in the subject matter that we're looking at, but we also may want to look at previous data. For example, what have other projects had to say? We need to talk about the project to make sure we understand what the heck it is we're trying to accomplish. So that produces two big outputs. One is the scope management plan, so we know how we're going to control the size of the scope, and how we're also going to make sure we are determining and meeting requirements. The scope management plan itself has a detailed statement of the scope, so a detailed statement of what this project is about, how big it is, stuff that is based off our project charter. Then we create a work breakdown structure. Somebody has to approve it and say yes, this works, or no, this doesn't. And the work breakdown structure will make more sense once you see it. Then we get acceptance from the stakeholders that, yeah, we have actually completed what we said we were going to do, and have methods to check that off. And we're also going to control what is and what is not inside of scope for the project, so that we can control requests for making that scope even bigger. So in terms of the requirements management plan, our good friends at PMP, the Project Management, or PMI rather, the Project Management Institute, have said that the requirements management plan is, quote, a condition or capability that is necessary to be present in a product, service, or to result to satisfy a need. In other words, what needs to happen to make this project actually work? What are the requirements of the project? So in terms of the requirements management plan, it tracks the following things. It tells us how we track how the project is actually rolling out, how we are tracking the changes to the configurations that happen in each step of the project, how we make sure which requirements are more important than others, because we can run out of funds due to unforeseen circumstances. So if we've got to start cutting, what do we keep? How do we produce metrics? In other words, what do we use to measure, and how do we track whether or not we're actually hitting what we said we would hit? So there's a lot of ways to collect requirements. Talking to the people who ultimately care about the product or service or might be using it. Customers, supervisors, employees, those are all good ways to collect stakeholders' requirements by interviewing them. We can also have focus groups and workshops. And there's all kinds of ways we can do this. Think about any way you would gather information inside of a company. Surveys can be great too, especially in the online world, for example. Or if we're creating a specific product, if our project is to create something, we might want to benchmark it against something else that's already been created. For example, is our requirement, if we're making a new pickup truck to compete with Ford and Chevy, well, we might want to look at the trucks that Ford and Chevy have made to determine how close ours needs to look to theirs in terms of features and capability. The purpose of this slide is just to show you how important it is to do a good job whenever you're getting requirements. When you're obtaining requirements, for example, as you go on in developing a product, in particular software, the longer that you wait to really refine your requirements, or the less well you refine your requirements, the more expensive it is to fix stuff. After a product is released, for example, it's very expensive to fix defects, problems, or things that did not satisfy the original scope. That's exactly why we want to be detailed in collecting our requirements. The better we know our requirements when we go into a production phase or a project, the better chance we're not going to have to fix them later. So we produce, whether it is in IT or project management in general, it's always smart to produce a requirements traceability matrix. This is also known as an RTM. All that means is that we come up with specific requirements that we can check off on the list. Here's a great example. One of the requirements is upgrading the laptop memory. We know it's a hardware issue. We know where the requirement came from as far as the source, and we can give a status report. So the requirement traceability matrix is a fancy way of saying we have a detailed checkoff list. Great thing to have in terms of making sure we're staying within scope. So in terms of best practices, I think this is really entertaining considering how much our text emphasizes agile as the latest catchphrase or latest buzzword that in terms of testing, in terms of testing software or hardware, don't just rely on the testers. In other words, get it out to end users. If you're doing a product or service, don't just rely on team members to tell you if you're hitting the mark or not. Get people who aren't involved in the project to come in as quality testers, and don't believe in the fads. So how do we define scope? The first thing we want is a project scope statement. And in terms of a scope description, we would want the product scope description, which means we're basically saying what the size of the project or product is, and also what is user acceptance criteria, meaning specifically what do we have to accomplish for the end user to have said, yes, you created the product I was searching for. And we would have detailed information on all the deliverables. It's always good to have other documentation as well, for example, boundaries, constraints, assumptions. So if we're assuming, for example, the product that we're creating will be used as a plugin for Microsoft Word, put that in the project boundaries. This is not intended. Let's say, for example, we are creating an automated piece of software to be able to do citations for graduate students. So you can do your APA right in text, something like a Zotero, for example. Well, we want to make sure that that was listed in the project boundaries. And also, if there's other references, if there's references to other documents or resources, put them in there as well. The scope gets more and more well-defined as a project continues. So here's an example how you can further define your scope. We start off with a project charter, for example, and you can see that the scope statement changes over time because we're getting more detail. We're getting a better picture of exactly what the scope of our project actually is. Again, we talk about project management being an iterative process. Here's a great example of it. So in terms of the root causes for failures, the point that is made by this slide is that basically we don't always do a great job in the world of computers or in the world of business for that matter, and really understanding what project requirements actually are. If we do a better job listening to the people who need the product or service or are sponsoring the product or service we're trying to build, the better chance we have of actually hitting those requirements. So next we're going to talk about creating the work breakdown structure. So what is a WBS, a work breakdown structure? It's a way of breaking down individual steps of a project into deliverables. So when we say it's a deliverable-oriented grouping of the work involved in the project that defines the total scope of the project, what we're really talking about is taking the work of the project down into actual deliverables. And we use a process called decomposition. If we're taking a high-end idea and breaking it down to smaller and smaller concepts, ultimately we're showing the end user and the team members what exactly we're going to be delivering. At the bottom level of the WBS, and you'll see this graphically represented in a moment, we get down to the lowest level, which is a work package, and that is ultimately what we're going to be delivering. Out of the WBS, we deliver what we refer to as the scope baseline and the project document updates. Now, the scope baseline is, yes, if everything goes according to plan, this is how big the project should be. And we also include the WBS graphics and what we refer to as WBS dictionary as well. So here's a great idea of a sample WBS. We have an intranet project, for example, that consists of website design, homepage design, marketing pages, sales pages. And with each level we go down to a higher level of detail. And we get down to, again, down to the bottom level, we get down into work packages. So here's a more detailed one, for example, that we get into a 5.0 software release, for example. And again, you take it down to lower levels and lower levels. To the furthest level, you can break it down in terms of the detail of the work that's going to be done. You can also use Microsoft Project to do work breakdown structures. In this case, we're not seeing them graphically represented. And the funny thing is, earlier versions of Microsoft Project actually did graphical block style WBSs. Project no longer does that, but there are a number of software packages that will. If we look, for example, in the WBS as it's listed in a graph or a text sense on the left-hand side, that ties in with the schedule on the right. So we are seeing a schedule-based, what we refer to as a Gantt chart. The work breakdown structure here theoretically could be broken down into the same blocks as we demonstrated on earlier slides. You're still in initiating, planning, and executing type phases, so you're sticking with the project management process groups. And again, here's a tabular form of a WBS. You could take all of these things and break them down into a graphical form if you chose to do so. So in terms of some of the approaches that we can take to developing a WBS, certain government organizations, certain companies have their own ways of doing work breakdown structures. Sometimes we can start off what we refer to as an analogy approach, and that is, let's look at other projects that look similar to the one we're doing and make a WBS that's similar. So if you've built a house before, why not use the same work breakdown structure and modify it to suit your needs? You can also do what we refer to as a top-down approach, where you start at the top of the project and work your way down to the levels of highest detail. The bottom-up approach means you're starting with the lowest level of detail and working your way up. So the example would be a top-down approach. We're going to say we want to build a house, so we're going to start looking at the house from the outside and working our way up. The bottom-up means we'd start at the foundation of the house and build from there up back to the top. And then we also have a mind mapping idea. And mind mapping simply means we're starting off with a basic idea and building structures out from a basic idea. And there's mind mapping software that'll do that, such as MindView, for example. So it facilitates kind of a mind mapping process. And again, you can also use similar software such as MindView, for example, to create a WBS from the mind map itself. And again, if we were an in-person class, it would be wonderful to be able to demonstrate some of these types of software to you. So what about the WBS itself? It's something that sounds simple. You're taking an idea and breaking it down into smaller ideas. But it's hard to get it right. It's hard to know where all the facets of a project should fit, under which category, for example. So how do you get good at this? Well, practice is one way. Asking people in your company who've already done these to show you samples are great as well. And there's lots of good software out there, some of it free, that will also help with this process as well. So a WBS dictionary means, because you're doing breakdown structures, you may be using abbreviations or terms that people aren't familiar with. You simply want to have a dictionary to make sure that if you're using abbreviations in those graphical representations of the project, that you are giving people some sort of a glossary to be able to use. So here's an example of the WBS dictionary. Here's an entry that gives more detail for what may have been illustrated in a WBS. And I won't read this to you because I think you can read that for yourself, but you get the idea of what we're talking about. So some advice for creating this sort of dictionary. Units of work should only take place one place in the WBS. In other words, if you've got the same action item in several layers of the WBS, it's redundant and should only be in one place. The work should basically sum up what comes below it. In other words, if you're breaking things down, every layer you go down should be more detailed and broken down from the layer above it. General good practice is that if you've got a work breakdown structure, you've got one person who's responsible, so you've got somebody you can call on. You also want to be realistic. If this WBS is an ideal you cannot achieve and does not represent the way the work's actually going to be done, aka politics, you want your WBS to show accurate depictions of how the work is actually going to be done. The people who are going to be working on this thing also should have some buy-in, so they believe in the way the work's going to be done. For example, if you're doing an engineering process with software, or if you're doing re-engineering of an office layout, or if your project is actually changing a staffing plan, the people who are involved, the stakeholders, should also be approving your changes to this as well. And your WBS also must be flexible, meaning if you have changes in the scope of the project, you need to be able to quickly reflect them in your WBS as well. So how do we validate scope? What it means to validate scope is to make sure that what we're putting down on paper as our plan actually makes sense. Even when we have a well-defined scope, we can still suffer from what we call scope creep. Scope creep simply means as a project goes from planning into practice, that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger because everybody wants more things. So scope creep is something to be avoided because it makes your cost and schedule uncontrollable. Scope validation means that somebody is empowered to be able to accept the final deliverables of the project. Could be a customer, could be a manager, but scope validation means at the end of a project that you have basically said, okay, this is the scope, this is the size of the project, yes, we agree, this is how big it should be, this is what you accomplished. So it can also be part of the closing of a project as well. So if you get too big with your project and you don't have clear definition, these are great examples of how you can spend lots of money and deliver next to nothing. It happens all the time. If you want to know how bad it can get, this is a fantastic example of the SBI border net, or SBI net border security failure. This was a multi-billion dollar, billion with a capital B, failure because there was no defined scope to the project. Nobody knew how big it should be. It was almost as though they were improvising and making it up as they went along. Read that link and you'll see what I'm talking about. So in terms of global issues, sometimes it's really hard to control scope across borders. If we're operating internationally, for example, language barriers can come into play, cultural barriers can come into play. What does the word big mean to you? It's a relative term. So the more specific, numerical, and measurable we get, the better chance we're going to have a scope that can actually be realistic and kept under control. So how do we control scope in a project? The goals of having scope control in the first place are to be able to control what might change the size of the project. At least we've got a way, if a change comes along, to be able to integrate it, accept it, or not. To have a procedure for deciding whether or not we're going to let this project get bigger and to manage changes when they happen. Because if you have a change in scope, chances are you're going to have a change in your time and your budget, and we'll be talking about that in time management in terms of how you control those issues. But the term variance comes out basically between what you planned would happen and what actually happened. If it's an increase in scope size, generally speaking, the people controlling the numbers are not happy. So how do we improve user input? If we are going along with a project and it needs to change size, I would say that you've got a way to be able to integrate input from team members in a way that also pleases the sponsors. Meaning that you're meeting with the people who are controlling the size of the project and implementing the project, including the sponsors. If we need to make, let's say for example, we're breaking ground on a new building, and we decided that the size of the building is going to be 600,000 square feet, and all of a sudden we've discovered a rock wall that we need to remove to be able to go forth, and all of a sudden we've got to reduce the size of the project, we've got to reduce the scope, or pay several $1 million to remove the rock wall we discovered. That's something your sponsors need to be involved with. And another thing that's a good idea in terms of having really good scope management, the people who are actually affected by the project that you're conducting, involve them with the people who are actually doing the project. In other words, if you're creating a new piece of software, take end users and put them in the process as well. They're going to give the software engineers a more realistic view of what actually takes place when somebody uses the software. So in terms of how to get fewer incomplete or changing requirements, have a change process. In other words, if you need to change the scope of the project, there needs to be a process for reviewing it. Some other great ideas, if you're doing things that are physical, for example, or software based, you can use prototyping or case modeling and try to predict if you build something to a certain size or specification, how it will behave. From homes to software, there are ways to do this. This sounds like a numbskull kind of thing to say, but it's true. Put it in writing. So if a requirement is something that everybody believes everyone should know on a project, sometimes nobody knows it. Write it down, write it down, write it down. The 3 rules of business, as quoted earlier. Make sure that you've put time in to test and evaluate, and if you are thinking about making changes, we say review changes from a systems perspective. Think about how that one change might affect everything else. And you better also build time and money into your budget. And we'll talk about this in later chapters, how you can handle changes or setbacks. So any project software that we can use, and these are things that seem fundamental, but we can use word processing or spreadsheets to manage the cost or even just document the project itself. But some other kinds of software, such as mind mapping, can help us really come up with powerful graphical representations of WBSs. And again, we'll be making use of project management software for creating work breakdown structures, at least from a text-based or schedule-based perspective. Although Microsoft Project doesn't do a good job of creating WBSs. Some free project management software packages, like, for example, Project Libre, actually do it, and they're free or cheap. So there's lots of ways around that as well. So things to consider if you're in the agile or adaptive environment. Basically, because you are doing small, quick projects, each iteration will give you a better example of the entire scope of the project. So it's less predictive, and there's a reason why we call agile methodologies Agile because they're quick and they're very responsive, but they're not predictive in the way that the typical project management is. Agile, for example, the scope may change somewhat from one Scrum to the next if you're using Scrum, for example. The bottom line is you're going to be more quickly and more frequently evaluating the size of the scope in an Agile environment. So some summary. In terms of scope, scope is another word for size of the project. The main processes are delineated as follows. Creating WBS's work breakdown structures is a fantastic rule of thumb and practice for just about any kind of project or even daily business use, and there are reasons why we try to make sure we've set the right size of the project and are also controlling it. Folks, I thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day.